Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for accepting my paper, and it's a really great honor and pleasure for me to be able to contribute to the conference. And yes, my name is Mikael Evdokimov. I'm a PhD candidate and university assistant at the University of Vienna. And the thoughts I'm going to share have evolved gradually in the course of my PhD research. I hope you can see my PowerPoint presentation. And I'd like to start, therefore, by referring to an event that inspired my PhD thesis in the first place. In 2017, there was a translation workshop in Armenia where a contemporary Turkish novel was collaboratively translated into Armenian. Given the fact that relations between Armenia and Turkey are tense and the borders are closed, the initiative made a strong claim. It was located within the Armenia-Turkey normalization process and was titled as Overcoming Borders Through Literature. Practically, it was not simply literature, but literary translation that in this way was attributed with reconciliatory potential. And this sparked my interest. The notion of translational activism is not new and has been studied, for example, by Maria Timochko. But within this notion, some novelty seems to be promised by the perspective to A, tap into the possibilities of performing literary translation as means of peace promotion, and B, to explore the ways of encouraging these possibilities in translator training. I'm going to operate with the terms peace promotion, reconciliation, and citizen diplomacy. Now let me explain why. Civil society campaigns between Armenia and Turkey are put into the broader framework of peace building. Meanwhile, there is a historic continuity of peace activities between these countries, which are defined as track 2 diplomacy, and these activities date back to the Turkish-Armenian Reconciliation Commission. The context suggests that peace building encompasses track 2 diplomacy or citizen diplomacy and reconciliation. And this is indeed a legitimate and theoretically explicable approach. The way Johan Galtung defines the term peace, it allows for peace promotion or conflict transformation to be applied as umbrella terms for different forms of peace work. For him, peace is, I quote, the absence or reduction of violence of all kinds and a non-violent and creative conflict transformation, whereas peace work is generally the work to reduce violence by peaceful means, end of quote. However, in Galtung's theory, there are considerable differences between peacekeeping, peacemaking, and peace building. Therefore, I'm giving my preference here to a theory-neutral term of peace promotion, with reconciliation on track 2 or citizen diplomacy being its 2 possible representatives or work models. Now let's start with reconciliation. There is a tremendous body of literature on reconciliation, which has been profoundly analyzed as to its scope of implications and applications. Translation scholars have addressed reconciliation in several post-colonial and post-conflict settings in Canada, Australia, South Africa, and their concerns were twofold. They highlighted first the very translation of the term, translating reconciliation, and second, the vision of translation as reconciliation. Reconciliation has been further recognized as a crucial part of, I quote, the mediating role that the translator must strive to provide in today's fractured and fractious world, end of quote. However, studies on translation and translators, let alone that and those of literature, in reconciliation or peace promotion are rare. Although translatorship in conflict has been the topic of some studies, it is questionable whether it is appropriate to equate translatorship in conflict to translatorship in peace promotion due to different concerns, premises, and goals linked to these 2 distinct viewpoints. Against this background, I'd like to raise 2 questions. First, how literature, literary translation, and literary translators can be outlined as, respectively, a medium, an instrument, and agents of peace promotion. And second, how this vision, its possibilities and limitations, can be investigated and assessed in scholarly thinking, practice, and possibly even training. And the following will be an attempt to find an answer to these questions. To begin with, what exactly can literature have to do with reconciliation? As the domain of hypothesizing and imagination, literature is claimed to be capable of shaping the aesthetical and ethical perceptions of the world, reconciling tensions and differences cognitively in minds and discursively in societies. This general, abstract credit goes in line with the psychological and psychoevolutionary evidence of the healing effects of writing and the empathetic potential of imagination and storytelling. And one tangible literary approach to reconciliation, which I'd like to introduce in the following, draws on these data. In this approach, the reconciliatory potential of literature is envisaged in the story's capacity of empathetic sharing and imagination. The author proposes the creation of a committee which would prevent the production and dissemination of pieces of writing which contain distorted, discriminating, or stereotyping depictions of certain ethnic groups. And what the author has in mind is the promotion of all kinds and genres of reconciliatory writing by all possible stakeholders, not only writers, but also oral storytellers, editors, publishers, distributors, teachers, etc. And therefore, he dismisses the attribute literary in favor of the more inclusive storytelling. Consequently, he proposes the concept storytelling reconciliation. It is supposed to indicate the potential contribution to reconciliation of these various stakeholders in the field of story production and dissemination. The concept of storytelling reconciliation seems particularly promising for current purposes. It allows for complementing the list of possible stakeholders with translators who equally possess the power to promote or reject certain kinds of narratives and shape the discursive pool of a society. Let us remember Jean-Paul Sartre's literature engagée. Maria Timochko refers to such engaged or committed literature when she introduces engagement as one possible mode of translational activism. In her view, engagement entails commitment and proactive networking with writers, publishers, other activists, and agents. Here we may ask once again, would not commitment and networking within engaged literature or literary engagement apply just as importantly and naturally to translators acting in the spirit of storytelling reconciliation? In fact, considering the possible genres, areas, and media by means of which translators could contribute to storytelling reconciliation, not only literary translators are appealed to within this framework. It welcomes all translators and all translations that promote narratives of nonviolence, inclusion, de-stereotyping, and so on. Now let's turn to track 2, or citizen diplomacy. The term was coined, and we may even say performed, in the 80s during the civic initiatives between Soviet and US citizens who pursued the de-escalation of the Cold War crisis. The term is supposed to complement the limits of the track 1, that is public diplomacy. It aims at the promotion of non-official, non-competitive, and face-to-face dialogue and cooperation between opinion-leading individuals from communities in conflict. The purpose being conflict transformation by means of breaking psychological biases and barriers in respective communities. The success of one of such citizen initiatives in the 90s is admitted to be continuously supported by excellent professional interpreters and facilitators. Their list contains 21 names, and their roles have been analyzed by Birgit Menzel. She reports that these citizen diplomacy interpreters had to work in a unique setting. They had to mediate hostilities, biases, and misunderstandings, often intervening in order to give a comment or an explanation. In contrast to a traditional setting, the interpreters stood in the limelight, visible and emotionally involved. Moreover, I quote, "It often fell to the interpreters to ease cultural tensions and conflicts." End of quote. Hence, this interpreter's performance went beyond language or culture mediation in encompassing even conflict mediation. This is a crucial observation for a general outline of the possibilities of peace-promoting agency for translators and interpreters. But at this point, we might wonder about any evidence of literary translators' agency within citizen diplomacy. And indeed, there was a literary translator, Antonina Boi, who, among numerous writers and scientists, provided workshops on literature, culture, and history at the Asylum Institute in California, one of the leading sponsors of citizen diplomacy initiatives. Worth mentioning here is also that another activist facilitated the literary dialogue between both countries by launching a Soviet-American book exchange. Apparently, citizen diplomacy can include a literary dimension where literary translators' engagement would be similarly characterized in terms of commitment and networking. In concrete terms, it would be manifest in proper literary and translation work, compare the collaborative translation in Armenia, but also in humanitarian, educational, or journalist activities, such as language training, literary workshops, book fairs, media campaigns. A peculiar fact is that one participant of the aforementioned translation in Armenia is active and visible in media, whereas another even works as a journalist. Maybe the intersection between translation and journalism will prove itself particularly promising in this context. In any case, speaking in general terms, such engagement would again consist in basically storytelling work. I'm approaching the last section of my presentation, where I'd like to address the question of the enhancement of future translators, conflict awareness, and peace-promoting agency. For a possible, structured, conflict or peace-sensible approach in translator training, interventionist pedagogy might prove itself useful. It was designed for the promotion of human rights and reconciliation in higher education classrooms. Its peculiar feature is that it adopts insights from the psychology of genocide, violence, and criminality, and it parallels these insights with literature samples and extracts. In this manner, interventionist pedagogy fosters and targets psychological, introspective work by operating with narratives and literature, and moreover with the very anti-violence, empathizing storytelling that was our red thread so far. I'll summarize the interventionist pedagogy's 4 principles and put them into translational perspective. Principle 1 and 2 bring up the issue of alterity and its social psychological magnitude. Principle 1 is about promoting empathetic identification with the other. It concentrates on the psychological dynamics of othering, stressing that the logic of us versus them can nourish and perpetuate biases and insensitivities towards outgroup members. And the self-identification with others is the key to empathizing with them. In the context of translation, these complex matters are implicated by the fact that translators are usually placed in an in-between space, suggesting that they are exposed to and are mediating between multiple mutual alterities, all the more so in conflicts and peace work. Compare the example of the Soviet American citizen diplomacy interpreters. Principle 2 is about preventing diffusion of responsibility. Basically, it highlights the dangers of the de-individuation and the identitary merge with normative role behaviors within group dynamics. Both can significantly impair the sense of personal responsibility and make blind to the humanity of others. What is enunciated here are possible situational tensions and conflicts between normative prescriptions and moral righteousness. Such would be the case, for example, with the expected invisibility, loyalty, and civility of translators, which they would defy by their visible interventions or value-driven refusals to translate. Principle 3 is about promoting moral engagement. It links psychology with linguistics in showing how moral disengagement reveals itself in demonizing narratives and language patterns. For example, narratives of justification of immoral acts, euphemistic downplaying of inhumane actions, dehumanizing comparisons, and so on. The main appeal is to be aware of language choices, whether mental, oral, or written. Thus, this principle accentuates the ethical and political responsibility for narratives and stories one produces, sponsors, or opposes. And this would apply to translators and their overall narratively embedded enterprise, as studied by Mona Baker. Finally, principle 4 is about promoting self-conception. It addresses the risks of the feeling of helplessness and pleads for self-empowerment. Essential for personal agency is the emotional self-confidence and the knowledge of the ways of effective intervention in a situation of conflict or human rights abuse. Strictly speaking, Principle 4 seeks to strengthen self-efficacy and foster civic intervenient agency. This is highly reminiscent of the notion of translation as intervention or translators as intervenient beings, whereas the subjective, self-related prerequisites of such agency are implicative of much discussed translational attitudes and self-attitudes, such as role perceptions, teloi, loyalties, dispositions toward own visibility or invisibility, and etc. To sum up, we may assume that handling alterities and processes of othering is a significant skill for translators in general and those engaged in peace promotion in particular. Acquiring this skill means making reflections and decisions upon one's own in-between position as a translator, one's role and goal perceptions, preparedness to be visible, etc. The question that arises here, does these topics deserve appropriate treatment in a peace-sensible translator training? And how is such a training to be designed? Can there be interventionist translator pedagogy? Within the interventionist pedagogy, students are supposed to work with pieces of literary and non-literary writing that topicalize empathy, otherness, trauma, migration, discrimination, and so on. They are encouraged to do field work, to write reading responses, and to compose inquiries into self-definitions, images of cultural foreigners, images of personal enemies. The goal is essentially the empathetic identification with others across all possible lines of difference. A translator training in this spirit would have to prioritize not the business and cognitive, but the emotional and the civic dimensions of professional engagement. Speaking with Bloom's taxonomy, such an outlook would mean a significant shift of the educational objectives from the cognitive to the affective domain, a shift from knowledge, comprehension, and analysis synthesis to awareness, responding, valuing, internalization, and so on. Importantly enough, these priorities don't seem to be totally new to translation studies, insofar as they underlie the methods and principles of Augusto Boal's Theater of the Oppressed, which was adapted to interpreter training by Mira Kadric. This emancipatory approach aims at encouraging future interpreters in situations of oppression to move beyond passive, even though mediative, spectatorship and take self-determined action as co-responsible protagonists of the story in steering this story in favor of the oppressed party. The above raised question about interventionist translator pedagogy can be answered affirmative in this instance. But if theater is to be regarded as language and discourse, as Boal suggests, we may wonder if discourse, that is, narratives and storytelling, can be the primary realm of similar educational stage work also for translators. As a matter of fact, within the narrative approach to conflict mediation, it is held that among multiple parallel stories, we humans live by, I quote, Some retellings are more rehearsed than others, end of quote. And stories played out more frequently have the power to construct reality. Hence, analogous to theatrical enactments and interventions in interpreter training, we could speak of narrative enactments and interventions in translator training. Civic and emotional intelligence would be equally crucial in it, but they would be worked out not theatrically, but narratively. Theatricality is supposed to unveil feelings, thoughts, potentials, and to deconstruct all taken for granted understandings. And the same holds true for critical narrative work. It is interesting to note that the Turkish-Armenian context here. It is admitted that, I quote, the debates and tensions between the Turkish and Armenian peoples manifest themselves today most vividly and consequentially as narratives. And reconciliation must first take place at the level of the narrative in order for there to be a legitimate and lasting peace. End of quote. Applying the vocabulary of Boal's image theater to the current agenda, the acting movement from an actual to an ideal image by means of a transitional one would mean narrative, maybe even imagological movement from stories and imageries of violence to those of peace. I'd like to conclude in the spirit of the question raised by Maria Timochko of, I quote, how to move forward in understanding the ethics and ideology of translation and in developing an approach to the political empowerment of translators, end of quote. Maybe one of the ways to do so will be, as I'd like to propose, to take the course towards an interdisciplinary approach or exchange between literary translation or translator studies on the one hand and peace and conflict studies on the other. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mikael, for this speech. Well, it was really very interesting, and Anna is applauding. Do we have some questions in the audience? Please do not hesitate. While you're thinking of it, I will just say that I completely agree with you, Mikael, and that translation trainers have also this civic responsibility, and it is to raise this ethical and political questions indeed. And I would just like to share with you experience that I had with my students. I gave them, so it was a second-year master literary translation course, and I gave them 3 novels to read and then to decide which one we will be translating. And one of them was Gaël Faye's PETRA-E, which talked about war in Rwanda. So they agreed and picked up that novel, precisely that one. And I was really very, very glad about it, because it was, for me, the sign that they're really responsible young people that want to translate this and this novel, and they wanted this novel to be published for Croatian readers, young Croatian readers, and in general the Croatian public. So we were working on a really interesting political and historical novel, very emotive, very which implied a lot of empathy from the translator point of view and the reader, of course. So I really do believe that our young students and future translators should be trained as well, not only to translate well, but also to be responsible citizens and to promote this peace and to work on it as well. So I completely agree, and I don't know if anyone would like to comment on this or ask a question.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, Letty, please.
Sorry, my typing skills are gone now. Do you feel these interactionist, interactivist translators, should they be part of the actual peace process? So should they represent one of the parties involved, or should they be third party, so not involved in the actual peace building process in any way?
What's an interesting question. I think it's also reminiscent of the image, the role of translators in general. Where do we stand? Who do we represent? And it's actually my PhD research is about that, about selves, about identity, alterity, and reconciliation. And this is probably one of the questions I'm going to ask my interviewees in future. And I think maybe when we speak about peace promotion, then the side you are standing for, you are representing is peace. Yeah, of course you represent one of the communities you came from, but maybe it is also difficult if you are bilingual, and if you are a migrant, you're traveling, you're crossing borders constantly, you represent both communities, you know them both. So I think if a translator wants to represent, of course we represent one community, but I think in order to promote this agenda of peace and conflict transformation, you shouldn't represent an ideology which could be counterproductive. I think that would be my answer to that. Because if I speak about Armenia, Turkey, the ideology in both countries is nationalism, extreme nationalism. And I think if you want to achieve some change, to some transformation, you have to learn to question that, to question what you have learned during your socialization. And yeah. I'll see what the literary translators in my research think themselves. It's really interesting. Yeah, and I wanted to comment on Wanda. Thank you for this interesting example from your practice. I think it's marvelous, and it's fascinating that students themselves came up with that. That like you didn't have to impose it, and I don't know what the other options were, but I think maybe there is
more neutral.
More neutral. Maybe there is raising awareness of this all in younger generation.
Particularly regarding to the fact that at the same time when the war happened in Rwanda, we had our own war in Yugoslavia, so they were quite sensible to that.
Yeah.
And I can also imagine that in Israel there must be some projects, literary projects dealing with Israeli and Palestinian authors and literatures. So I suppose that literary translators are involved in this kind of project.
Yeah, there is actually a contribution by Hannah Amit Kochavi. She made a study about literary translators and interviewed them and asked if they would see their translations, their efforts as part of the peace building efforts, and they said yes, they definitely regard their activities as conflict transformative. So this is one of the few studies I came across with. So
thank you very much for this contribution.